The stars burned cold and distant beyond the massive windows of the Imperial flagship, and Marcus Webb pushed his cleaning cart through the lower corridors without looking up at them anymore. He had stopped admiring the view months ago. The Eternal Flame was the largest ship Marcus had ever seen, a vessel so enormous that it contained entire cities within its golden hull, and it served as the mobile throne of Emperor Velthrix the Undying, ruler of the Draconari Empire. The Draconari were ancient beings who resembled the dragons of Earth mythology, standing between 8 and 12 feet tall, with scales that shimmered like precious metals, and eyes that glowed with inner fire. They had conquered 7 star systems, while humans were still learning to farm wheat, and they never let anyone forget it. Marcus was 34 years old, a former paramedic from a small colony world called New Bristol, and now he cleaned toilets and scrubbed floors for aliens who barely knew he existed. It was not the life he had planned for himself. 5 years ago, he had run a small emergency clinic on the colony, saving lives and training young medics and feeling like he mattered in the universe. Then the border war came, and Draconari warships clashed with another empire in the skies above New Bristol, and his clinic became rubble in a single afternoon. He lost everything except his life, and sometimes he wondered if that was really a blessing. The Draconari did not hate humans exactly, but they did not respect them either. To the Dragon Lords of the 7 systems, humans were primitives who had stumbled into space travel by accident, useful only for tasks that were beneath Draconari dignity. Cleaning was one of those tasks. Marcus wore a gray jumpsuit with no name tag because the Draconari did not care to learn human names, and he moved through the ship like a ghost, invisible and silent and utterly forgettable. That was the way they preferred it, and Marcus had learned to accept his place in the order of things. Tonight he worked the medical wing on Deck 47, sanitizing the floors and walls and equipment with solutions that killed bacteria from 100 different worlds. The medical wing was busier than usual, filled with Draconari physicians in silver robes who rushed from room to room with worried expressions on their scaled faces. Marcus knew something important was happening, but he did not ask questions because humans did not ask questions. He simply cleaned around the chaos and pretended not to notice. But he noticed everything. Old habits from his paramedic days refused to die, and his eyes automatically tracked the movement of staff and the readings on monitors, and the supplies being rushed into the largest private room at the end of the corridor. Someone important was very sick. Room. Not because he was curious, but because the floor needed cleaning everywhere, and if he happened to overhear conversations while he worked, then that was not his fault. 2 Draconari physicians stood outside the door, speaking in low voices, and they did not bother to lower their voices further when Marcus approached, because why would they worry about a human janitor understanding their words? "The prince grows weaker by the hour," one of them said, his golden scales dull with exhaustion. "Lord Mordrek has tried every treatment in the ancient texts, but nothing stops the decay. If the heir dies, the succession crisis will tear the empire apart," the other physician replied, her voice tight with fear. "The emperor has no other children, and the noble houses are already circling like predators." Marcus kept his head down and his mop moving, but his heart beat faster with this information. Prince Kyrithos, the only son of Emperor Velthrix, was dying in that room, and the greatest medical minds of the Draconari Empire could not save him. He should not care about this because the Draconari had never cared about him. But Marcus found that he could not simply ignore a sick child, no matter what species that child belonged to. It was a weakness he had never managed to overcome. The door to the prince's room opened, and a tall Draconari in elaborate silver and gold robes emerged with a grim expression. This was Lord Mordrek, the royal physician, a being of immense prestige who had served the imperial family for 3 centuries. The prince requires absolute rest and silence, Lord Mordrek announced to the gathered staff. Only essential personnel may enter his chamber, and his specialized healing diet must be delivered precisely on schedule. Will he recover, my lord? One of the younger physicians dared to ask. Lord Mordrek's eyes flickered with something Marcus could not identify. Before the royal physician composed his features into a mask of professional concern. We must have faith in the ancient treatments, Lord Mordrek said smoothly. The prince is young and strong, and the imperial bloodline does not surrender easily to disease. Marcus watched Lord Mordrek walk away down the corridor, and something about the royal physician's manner made his instincts prickle with unease. He had seen that particular kind of smooth confidence before, in doctors who were hiding bad news, or covering their mistakes, or sometimes hiding something worse. But that was ridiculous, because what could a human cleaning worker possibly know about Draconari medicine, or Draconari politics, or anything else that mattered in this vast and ancient empire? He was nobody, a ghost, a pair of hands that pushed a mop. Marcus finished cleaning the corridor, and moved on to the waste disposal area, putting the sick prince out of his mind, because it was not his business and not his problem. Except he could not stop thinking about it. Throughout his shift, he found his thoughts returning to that closed door and the dying child behind it, and the physicians who seemed so helpless despite all their advanced technology and ancient wisdom. The Draconari had been practicing medicine for 10,000 years, and they possessed genetic engineering and psychic healing and techniques that humans could barely imagine. How could they fail to cure one sick boy, unless they were missing something obvious, something so simple that their advanced minds overlooked it entirely? Marcus shook his head and told himself to stop being foolish. He was a janitor now, not a healer, and his opinions about alien medicine were worth less than nothing in this place. But when his shift ended, and he returned to his tiny cabin in the human workers' quarters, he lay awake for hours, staring at the metal ceiling, and thinking about the salmon. He remembered why he had become a paramedic in the first place, back on Earth, before he ever dreamed of traveling to the stars. His little sister had been sick when they were children, and the doctors had given up on her, but Marcus had refused to accept their verdict. He had researched her condition obsessively, and found a small clinic in another city that was trying an experimental treatment. And he had convinced his parents to take her there against the advice of every expert they consulted. His sister survived because Marcus refused to stop looking for answers. That same stubborn refusal to accept defeat had driven him through medical training and through 15 years of emergency medicine, and through the destruction of his clinic and his old life. It still burned inside him now, even when he had no right to feel it. A Draconari prince was dying somewhere above him in this massive ship, and Marcus Webb was going to find out why. Did not know yet that this decision would change the course of an empire. But he knew that he could not look away from suffering just because it was not his place to help. Some things mattered more than knowing your place. Marcus began requesting extra shifts in the medical wing, and his supervisor approved without question, because no other human worker wanted to clean near the dying prince. The Draconari believed that death was contagious in some spiritual sense, and they avoided the medical wing as much as their duties allowed. Marcus did not believe in contagious death, but he did believe in paying attention. For the next several days he cleaned the same corridors at the same times, watching and listening and learning everything he could about Prince Kyrithos and his mysterious illness. The Draconari physicians still ignored him completely, discussing their patient openly as if Marcus were a piece of furniture that happened to move on its own. He learned that the prince was 197 years old, which made him roughly equivalent to a human teenager. And he learned that the illness had begun suddenly 3 months ago, with no apparent cause. Symptoms were devastating. His scales had lost their metallic shine and become dull and brittle. His flame glands had weakened until he could barely produce smoke instead of fire, and his body was slowly wasting away despite eating regular meals. The physicians called it scale rot, an ancient disease that had not appeared in the Draconari royal bloodline for over 2,000 years, and they treated it with remedies from ancient texts that seemed to have no effect whatsoever. Marcus listened to all of this and made mental notes, comparing what he heard to the patterns he observed with his own eyes. He noticed that the prince's condition seemed to fluctuate throughout the day, sometimes appearing slightly stronger in the morning and then declining sharply after his midday meal. He noticed that the specialized healing diet Lord Mordrek had prescribed was delivered in sealed containers that only the royal physician's personal staff handled. Mordrek visited the prince 3 times daily, always at mealtimes, and always dismissed other staff from the room during these visits. These observations meant nothing by themselves, but together they formed a pattern that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable. One night during the 3rd shift, when the medical wing was nearly empty, Marcus was cleaning the floor outside the prince's chamber when he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was a weak cry, barely more than a whisper, coming from behind the closed door. The monitoring drones that usually hovered around the prince's bed were nowhere to be seen, and the night nurse had stepped away to handle an emergency elsewhere on the ship. Marcus knew he should keep working and ignore what he had heard, because entering a royal chamber without permission was a crime punishable by death. But the cry came again, and it sounded so young, and so afraid, and so alone. Marcus pushed open the door. It was enormous, and decorated with gold and precious stones. But Marcus barely noticed the luxury, because his attention went immediately to the bed where Prince Kyrathos lay. The prince was smaller than Marcus had expected, perhaps 7 feet long from snout to tail, with scales that should have been bright copper, but had faded to a sickly gray-brown color. His eyes were half-closed and glazed with fever, and his breath came in shallow, painful gasps that made his whole body shudder. He looked like he was dying, and he looked terrified. Marcus approached the bed slowly with his hands visible and his voice soft. "Hey there," he said gently, using the same tone he had used with frightened patients in his clinic years ago. "Can you hear me?" The prince's eyes opened wider, and for a moment confusion replaced the fear, as he tried to understand what a human was doing in his room. "Who?" the prince managed to whisper, in broken universal common, the trade language that all species in the galaxy shared. "Who are you?" "My name is Marcus, and I work on this ship as a cleaner," Marcus replied honestly. "I heard you call out, and I wanted to make sure you were okay." "I am." The prince paused to take a shaking breath. "I am not okay." "I know," Marcus said, and he felt his heart breaking for this child who had been born into immense privilege, but now lay dying surrounded by physicians who could not help him. "Is there anything I can do for you right now?" The prince stared at him with eyes that glowed dimly orange, instead of the bright gold they should have been. "No one can help me," the prince said, with the terrible certainty of someone who had accepted their fate. "The physicians say the ancient remedies will work, but I feel myself getting weaker every day, and I think they are lying to make me feel better." Marcus moved closer and sat on a small stool beside the bed, breaking every rule of protocol and not caring at all. "Tell me about your symptoms," he said. "Tell me exactly what you feel and when you feel it." The prince seemed surprised that anyone wanted to hear him talk about his illness, but he answered anyway, perhaps because he was lonely, or perhaps because Marcus was the first person in months who had looked at him like a patient instead of a political crisis. He described the constant fatigue that never went away no matter how much he slept, the burning sensation in his stomach after meals, the way his scales itched and flaked off in patches, and the strange metallic taste in his mouth that had appeared around the same time the illness began. Marcus listened carefully and asked questions that the Draconari physicians had apparently never thought to ask. When did the symptoms get worse during the day? After meals, the prince admitted, especially after the special healing food that Lord Mordrek prepared for him. Had anyone else eaten from the same food supply? No, the healing diet was prepared exclusively for the prince in Lord Mordrek's private kitchen. Did the prince remember eating anything unusual right before the illness began? The prince thought for a long moment, and then said that Lord Mordrek had begun adding a new supplement to his meals about a week before the first symptoms appeared. Something the royal physician called an ancient immune booster. Marcus felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as the pieces came together in his mind. He was not an expert on Draconari biology, but he knew the signs of poisoning when he saw them, and everything the prince described pointed towards someone deliberately introducing a toxin into his food. Prince Kurithos, Marcus said carefully, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to trust me, even though I am just a human cleaner, and you have no reason to listen to anything I say. Prince looked at him with tired eyes that held a spark of something that might have been hope. You are the first person who has asked me how I feel, instead of telling me what I should feel, the prince said quietly. Ask your question. Do you trust Lord Mordrek completely? The prince was silent for a long moment, and Marcus could see thoughts moving behind those dim golden eyes. I trusted him, the prince finally admitted. But lately he watches me in a way that makes me uncomfortable, and he always makes sure I eat every bite of my healing meals, even when I tell him I feel too sick to be hungry. Marcus nodded slowly and made a decision that would either save a life or end his own. I think someone may be hurting you on purpose, he said. I cannot prove it yet, but I am going to try. Why? The prince asked with genuine confusion. Why would a human risk anything for me? Marcus smiled sadly and remembered his sister and his clinic and all the patients he had ever fought to save. Because you are sick and afraid and alone, he said simply, and because helping people who are suffering is the only thing I've ever been good at. The prince reached out one weak, clawed hand and touched Marcus on the arm, a gesture that carried immense meaning in Draconari culture. Then I will trust you, Marcus the human, the prince whispered, because you are the only one who has treated me like I matter more than my title. Marcus squeezed the prince's hand gently, and then slipped out of the room before anyone could discover that he had been there. He had a theory now, but he needed proof before he could act. The fate of an empire rested on what he did next, and Marcus Webb was just a janitor with a mop and a stubborn refusal to let a child die. Marcus knew he could not approach the emperor directly, because a human cleaning worker would never be allowed anywhere near the throne room, and he knew he could not confront Lord Mordrek, because that would alert the royal physician that someone suspected him. He needed to find someone with power and authority who might actually listen to a human, and that was nearly impossible on a ship full of beings who considered his entire species barely more intelligent than trained animals. But Marcus remembered a name he had heard whispered in the corridors. Lady Cithara, the Emperor's senior advisor and one of the oldest Draconari on the ship. The other workers said she was different from the rest of the nobility, that she sometimes nodded at humans in the corridors, and had once stopped a Draconari officer from beating a human cook for a minor mistake. It was not much, but it was more respect than Marcus had seen from any other Draconari in his months aboard the ship. Eternal Flame. Finding Lady Cithara was easier than Marcus expected, because she kept regular hours in her office on Deck 12, and did not surround herself with guards like most of the nobility. Getting an audience with her was another matter entirely. Marcus waited outside her office for 3 days during his off hours, standing quietly against the wall, while Draconari officials and nobles came and went without noticing him. On the third day, Lady Scythara emerged from her office and stopped when she saw him. "You have been standing there for quite some time, human," she said in a voice that was curious rather than hostile. "Do you require something?" Marcus stepped forward and bowed deeply in the Draconari manner, hoping he was doing it correctly. "My lady, I have information about Prince Kyrathos that I believe is vital to his survival, and I humbly request a moment of your time to share it." Lady Scythara's eyes narrowed, and Marcus could see her assessing him with sharp intelligence that had nothing to do with prejudice. "You are a sanitation worker," she said. "How would you have any information about the prince's medical condition?" "I was a healer on my homeworld before I came to this ship," Marcus replied. "I have been observing the prince's symptoms and the patterns of his treatment, and I believe I have identified something that the royal physician has missed." "Or something that the royal physician does not wish anyone to identify?" Lady Scythara asked quietly, and Marcus felt a surge of hope, because she understood what he was suggesting without him having to say it directly. "I cannot make accusations against a being of Lord Mordrek's standing without evidence, my lady," Marcus said carefully. "But I believe that if the prince's food were tested by an independent laboratory, the results would be very interesting." Lady Scythara studied him for a long moment. Marcus forced himself to stand still under her gaze, even though every instinct told him to look away from those ancient golden eyes. "Come inside," she finally said. "Tell me everything you have observed, and do not leave out any details, no matter how small they seem." Marcus followed her into the office, and spent the next hour explaining everything he had seen and heard and deduced over the past several days. He described the pattern of the prince's symptoms worsening after meals, the sealed containers that only Lord Mordrek's staff handled, the new supplement that had been added to the prince's diet right before the illness began, and the strange metallic taste that the prince had mentioned. Lady Scythara listened without interrupting, and when Marcus finished, she sat in silence for several minutes. "What you suggest is treason of the highest order," she said finally. "If Lord Mordrek is truly poisoning the prince, he is not acting alone, because he does not have the resources or the motive to destroy the imperial bloodline by himself." "I understand that this is bigger than one physician," Marcus agreed. "But right now, my only concern is saving the prince's life, and if we do not act quickly, I fear there will be nothing left to save." Lady Scythara nodded slowly, and then did something that shocked Marcus completely. She stood and bowed to him, a shallow bow, but a bow nonetheless, a gesture of respect that no Draconari had ever offered him. "You have risked your life to bring me this information," she said. "Whatever your species, that is an act of courage worthy of recognition." She arranged for a sample of the prince's food to be intercepted and tested without Lord Mordrek's knowledge, and the results came back within 2 days. The food contained trace amounts of a substance called void blossom extract, a compound that was harmless to adult Draconari, but highly toxic to juveniles. Flame glands had not yet fully developed. In small doses over time, it would cause exactly the symptoms that Prince Kyrathos was experiencing, and it would eventually kill him in a way that looked like natural disease. Lord Mordrek was arrested in his private quarters, and under interrogation he confessed everything. He was an agent of House Varenthal, a rival noble family that had been enemies of the Emperor's bloodline for thousands of years. His mission was to end the imperial line by killing the only heir, triggering a succession crisis that House Varenthal could exploit to seize power. The conspiracy reached deep into the ship's crew, and even into the imperial court itself. Prince Kyrathos was immediately taken off the poisoned diet and given proper treatment to flush the toxin from his system. Within days, his condition began to stabilize, and for the first time in months, there was real hope that he would survive. Relieved, but instead, he felt a growing sense of danger as he moved through the ship's corridors. Too many eyes followed him now, and too many whispers stopped when he approached. Lord Mordrek's allies knew that a human had exposed their plot, and they were not the type of beings who forgave such interference. The attack came on the 5th night after Lord Mordrek's arrest. Marcus was walking back to his quarters through a maintenance corridor, when 3 masked figures emerged from the shadows ahead of him. They were Draconari, their scales painted black to hide their identities, and they carried weapons that hummed with deadly energy. "The human who thinks he can meddle in imperial politics," one of them said with cold amusement. "Did you really believe there would be no consequences for your interference?" Marcus backed away slowly, his heart pounding, but his mind racing through his options. He knew this ship better than most beings. Realized, because cleaners went everywhere and noticed everything, and he had memorized the layout of the maintenance tunnels during his months of invisible work. "I was just trying to save a sick child," Marcus said, buying time as he calculated the distance to the nearest emergency hatch. Politics had nothing to do with it. "The prince's death would have changed the course of history," the leader of the assassins replied. "And you, a worthless human, disrupted plans that were centuries in the making." They lunged at him, and Marcus ran. He was smaller and weaker than any Draconari, but he was also faster in tight spaces, and he knew exactly where he was going. He dove through an emergency hatch and scrambled into a narrow maintenance tunnel that was designed for repair drones rather than full-sized beings. The Draconari tried to follow, but their larger bodies could not fit through the opening, and Marcus heard them cursing as he crawled deeper into the ship's infrastructure. He spent the rest of the night hiding in the maintenance tunnels, moving carefully from section to section, and avoiding any space large enough for his pursuers to reach. By morning, he had made his way to the security office and reported the attack, but he knew that the assassins would try again. He had made powerful enemies, and they would not stop until he was dead. What Marcus did not know was that word of the attack had already reached the highest levels of the ship. Emperor Veilthrix had learned that someone had tried to kill the human who saved his son, and the Dragon Emperor was not pleased. A summons was coming that would change Marcus Webb's life forever. The Imperial Guards found Marcus in the worker dormitory the next morning, and for a terrible moment he thought the assassins had connections in the security forces, and he was about to die. But the guards did not attack him. Instead, they told him to come with them immediately, because Emperor Veilthrix the Undying demanded his presence in the throne room. Marcus had never been above Deck 30 in his entire time on the ship, and the throne room was on Deck 1, in the golden spire that crowned the eternal flame like a blazing sun. He followed the guards in stunned silence as they led him through corridors of increasing magnificence, past walls decorated with precious metals and gemstones, and artwork that depicted 10,000 years of Draconari history. Other Draconari stopped and stared as he passed, their expressions ranging from confusion to disgust to outright hostility. A human in the upper decks was unprecedented, and a human being escorted to the throne room. The throne room was unthinkable. The throne room itself was the most magnificent space Marcus had ever seen. It was a vast circular chamber with a domed ceiling that displayed a perfect holographic representation of the 7 star systems the Draconari Empire controlled. The walls were lined with noble Draconari in elaborate robes and armor, hundreds of them, all watching Marcus with cold reptilian eyes as he walked the long path toward the throne. And on that throne sat Emperor Veilthrix the Undying. The Emperor was 12 feet tall, even while seated, with scales of pure burnished gold and eyes that burned like twin suns. He wore robes of black and crimson that seemed to absorb the light around them, and a crown of twisted metal rested on his massive horned head. Power radiated from him like heat from a furnace, and Marcus felt his knees weaken with the primal urge to bow down before this being who had ruled an empire for longer than human. Civilization had existed, but Marcus forced himself to keep walking until he reached the designated spot 10 feet from the base of the throne. And then he knelt, as he had seen Draconari servants kneel, with his head bowed and his hands pressed flat against the floor. The silence in the throne room was absolute. "Rise, human," the Emperor commanded, and his voice echoed through the chamber like thunder rolling across mountains. "I would look upon the being who saved my son." Marcus stood on shaking legs and raised his eyes to meet the Emperor's gaze. He expected to see coldness or contempt, or perhaps grudging gratitude, but what he saw instead surprised him completely. Emperor Vilthrix was looking at him with genuine curiosity, as if Marcus were a puzzle that the ancient ruler could not quite solve. "My advisors tell me that you are a sanitation worker," the Emperor said. "They tell me that you noticed something in my son's treatment that the finest physicians in my empire failed to see, and that you risked your life to bring this information to Lady Cythara, rather than keeping silent as your station required." "That is correct, Your Majesty," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will. "I would know why," the Emperor continued. "Why would a human, a member of a species that my people have never treated with particular kindness, concern himself with the fate of a Draconari prince?" The entire court was watching him, and Marcus knew that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but perhaps the fate of every human in the empire. He could give a diplomatic answer, something about loyalty to the empire or gratitude for employment, but that would be a lie, and he suspected the Emperor would see through it instantly. So he told the truth. "I was a healer before I came to this ship, Your Majesty," Marcus said. "I spent 15 years saving lives. Then I lost everything in a war I had no part in, and I thought that part of me was dead forever." He paused and took a breath before continuing. "But when I heard your son cry out in pain, I discovered that I was wrong, because I could not ignore a sick child who was afraid and alone, no matter what species he belonged to." "My physicians have studied medicine for centuries," the Emperor said, leaning forward on his throne. "They possess knowledge and technology that your primitive species cannot begin to comprehend, and yet they failed where you succeeded. How is this possible?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "Your physicians are brilliant, Your Majesty, and their knowledge is far beyond anything I could ever achieve. But they were looking for complex solutions to what they assumed was a complex problem, and they did not consider that the answer might be simple. They also spoke freely in front of me, because they assumed a human cleaner could not possibly understand anything important, and that allowed me to observe patterns they might have hidden from each other." A murmur went through the assembled nobles, and Marcus saw anger on many faces at the suggestion that Draconari arrogance had contributed to the prince's suffering. But the Emperor raised one massive clawed hand, and the murmuring stopped instantly. "You are suggesting that our pride blinded us," the Emperor said slowly. "That we were so certain of our superiority that we could not see what was happening beneath our very snouts." "I am suggesting that everyone has blind spots, Your Majesty," Marcus replied. "Even the greatest among us can miss the obvious when we are too close to a problem or too certain of our assumptions. That is true for humans as much as it is for Draconari." The Emperor stared at him for a long moment, and then something remarkable happened. Vilthrix smiled. It was not a warm smile exactly, but it was genuine, and it transformed his terrible ancient face into something almost approachable. "You speak to me with more honesty than most of my own courtiers dare," the Emperor said. "You do not flatter or grovel or tell me what you think I want to hear. I find this refreshing." Before Marcus could respond, a commotion at the side of the throne room drew everyone's attention. A door opened, and Prince Kirathos entered, supported by two nurses, but walking on his own feet for the first time in months. His scales were still dull, and his movements were weak, but his eyes burned with determination as he made his way toward the throne. "Kirathos, you should be resting," the emperor said with obvious concern. "I needed to be here, father," the prince replied. "I needed to see the human who saved my life." The prince stopped in front of Marcus and looked at him with eyes that were already brighter than they had been during their midnight conversation. The prince said, "You came to me when I was alone and afraid. You listened to me when no one else would, and you believed that I was worth saving when I had stopped believing it myself. Among my people there is an ancient ritual for acknowledging a debt that can never be repaid." The assembled nobles gasped as Prince Kirathos extended his clawed hand and drew a thin line of blood across his own palm. "I offer you the blood oath of House Vaelthrix," the prince declared in a voice that carried to every corner of the throne room. "From this day forward, you and your descendants are under the eternal protection of my bloodline. Harm done to you is harm done to the imperial family, and your enemies are our enemies. This oath I swear on the fire in my blood and the honor of my ancestors." The throne room erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted in outrage that a human could receive such an honor, while others argued that the prince was within his rights and the oath was valid. Marcus stood frozen in shock as the prince reached out and grasped his hand, mingling Draconari blood with human skin in a ritual that had not been performed across species lines in the entire history of the Empire. Through it all, Emperor Vaelthrix watched in silence, and when the shouting finally died down, he spoke. "My son has made his choice, and I will not dishonor it. The blood oath stands." The Emperor turned his burning gaze back to Marcus. "It seems you have become part of our family, human. I suggest you get used to it." Marcus looked at the prince who had clasped his hand, and then at the Emperor who had accepted him, and he realized that his life would never be the same. He was no longer invisible. For better or worse, the human janitor had become someone who mattered. The weeks following the blood oath ceremony were among the strangest of Marcus Webb's life. He was moved from the cramped worker dormitory to quarters in the upper decks, rooms that were larger than his entire clinic had been back on New Bristol. Imperial guards were assigned to protect him at all times, not because the Emperor feared for Marcus's safety, but because attacking someone under the blood oath was considered an attack on the imperial family itself. The assassins who had tried to kill him in the maintenance corridors were hunted down and executed, and House Varenthal faced consequences that would echo through Draconari politics for generations. But Marcus did not care about politics or revenge or his new comfortable quarters. He cared about the young prince who was slowly recovering in the medical wing, and he visited Kirathos every day to check on his progress and simply to talk. Their friendship was an unlikely one, a human in his 30s, and a Draconari who had already lived for nearly 2 centuries, but they found common ground in unexpected places. Kirathos was curious about everything human, from their short lifespans to their strange customs to the way they formed emotional bonds so quickly and so deeply. Marcus told him about Earth, about the oceans and forests and cities of his homeworld, about the history of human space exploration and the colony worlds where his species had spread among the stars. In return, Kirathos taught Marcus about Draconari culture, the ancient traditions and complex social hierarchies, and the long view of history that came from living for thousands of years. The prince also told him things that no human had ever heard, secrets of the imperial family, and the true nature of Draconari power, and the fears that kept even the mightiest dragon lords awake at night. "My people are dying, Marcus," Kirathos confided one evening as they sat together watching the stars stream past the medical wing windows, not from disease or war, but from something worse. "We have become so certain of our superiority that we have stopped growing, stopped learning, stopped seeing the universe as anything but a collection of resources to exploit. I have watched it happen for 200 years, and I did not understand what I was seeing until you showed me. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how to respond. Every species goes through periods like that, he finally said. Humans have done the same thing many times in our history, becoming so proud of our achievements that we forgot how much we still had to learn. But we always found our way back eventually, usually because someone or something forced us to see ourselves clearly. Perhaps I am that something for my people, Kirathos said, thoughtfully. Perhaps this illness and your kindness have given me a perspective that no other Draconari of my generation. He turned to look at Marcus with eyes that were now bright gold again, fully recovered from the poison that had nearly killed him. When I become emperor someday, I want to change things. I want my people to see other species as partners instead of servants, as equals instead of inferiors. Will you help me, Marcus? Will you stay and show my people what humans can truly be? Marcus had not planned to stay. He had thought that once the prince recovered, he would return to his old life, perhaps finding another clinic on another colony world where he could practice medicine again. But as he looked at this young dragon who had become his friend, he realized that the universe had offered him something more meaningful than he had ever imagined. I will stay, Marcus said, for as long as you need me. Emperor Vaelthrix issued a proclamation 3 months later that shocked the entire empire. To be classified as primitive laborers, and discrimination against them in employment and housing and education was officially forbidden. Marcus Webb was appointed to a newly created position called Imperial Medical Liaison, tasked with studying human medical practices and finding ways to integrate them into Draconari healthcare. It was controversial, and many noble houses protested loudly that the ancient empire needed no lessons from a species that had only discovered fire a few thousand years ago. But the emperor's word was law, and slowly, reluctantly, the empire began to change. Marcus did not seek fame or power in his new role. He built a small team of human and Draconari medical professionals, focusing on the simple principles that had guided his career since the beginning. Observe carefully, listen to patients, never assume you know everything. He trained young Draconari physicians to see their patients as individuals rather than problems to be solved, to consider simple explanations before complex ones, and to never dismiss information just because it came from an unexpected source. The results were remarkable. Draconari medicine had been stagnant for centuries, trapped in tradition and ceremony. But the fresh perspective that Marcus and his team brought sparked a renaissance of medical innovation. New treatments were developed, ancient diseases were conquered, and for the first time in generations, the Draconari began to question whether their old ways were truly the best ways. Prince Kirathos continued to heal, growing stronger every month until he was fully recovered and ready to take on the duties of an imperial heir. But he was not the same prince he had been before his illness. He spent time in the lower decks talking to workers of all species, learning their names and their stories and their concerns. He argued with his tutors about history and politics and the nature of. He became known throughout the empire as a different kind of prince, one who listened more than he commanded, and who treated everyone he met with genuine respect. Years passed, and Marcus grew older, while his Draconari friends barely changed at all. He knew that he would not live to see all the changes that Kirathos dreamed of making, that human lifespans were too short to witness the transformation of a 10,000-year-old empire. But he also knew that he had planted seeds that would grow long after he was gone. When Emperor Vaelthrix finally passed into the eternal flames after a reign of 4,000 years, Prince Kirathos ascended to the throne as Emperor Kirathos I of his name. His coronation speech surprised everyone who heard it. I stand before you today because a human janitor refused to look away from a sick child, the new emperor declared, to the assembled nobles and dignitaries from across the galaxy. Because someone who had every reason to hate my people chose compassion over bitterness and courage over safety. My friend Marcus Webb taught me that true strength is not measured in power or wealth or the length of one's life, but in the willingness to help those who are suffering even when it costs you everything. That is the example I will follow as your emperor. That is the legacy I will build. Marcus Webb died peacefully in his sleep 3 years later, surrounded by friends from half a dozen species who had gathered to honor a man who had changed the course of history without ever seeking recognition. Emperor Kerathos declared a day of mourning across all 7 systems of the Empire, the first time such an honor had ever been given to a human. And in the history books that would be written centuries later, scholars would trace the transformation of the Draconari from conquerors to partners, from masters to equals, back to a single moment in time. Time. A dying prince crying out in the darkness. A humble cleaner who chose to answer. And a lesson that the galaxy would never forget. That compassion requires no throne, heroism needs no permission, and the smallest act of kindness can echo through eternity. The human species would go on to become one of the great civilizations of the galaxy, respected and admired by beings who had once dismissed them as primitives. But they never forgot Marcus Webb, the janitor who saved an empire by simply caring about a sick child. And neither did the dragons.